We've all heard the word reparation thrown around, but what does it actually mean? It's not just something you find in history books or hear in political debates. At its very heart, it's about one of the most basic human questions there is. How do you make things right after something has gone profoundly wrong? So, let's dive in. To really get our heads around this, let's start small. Just imagine you're at a friend's house and you accidentally knock over a vase they absolutely love. It shatters on the floor. What's that immediate sinking feeling you get in your stomach? Your first impulse, right, that gut reaction is to try and make it right. You apologize, probably a lot. You offer to pay for it. Maybe you even try to find someone who can glue it back together perfectly. You just want to repair the damage you caused. Okay, now let's take that idea and scale it way, way up. What happens when the broken vase isn't a vase at all, but the lives, the livelihoods, and the futures of entire communities? And what if the one who caused all that harm wasn't just one person, but an entire state? Well, that, in a nutshell, is the massive question at the very heart of reparation. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at what reparations actually is. Then, we'll get into the legal side of things. After that, we'll see it in action with some real-world examples. And we'll wrap it all up with the key things you really ought to remember. All right, part one. What is reparation? The very first thing to get is that this idea is so much bigger and broader than just a simple cash payment. The way we understand the term today really started to take shape after World War II. It comes from this German word Wiedergutmachung, which is, well, it's a really powerful concept. It literally means to make good again. See how that shifts the focus? It's not just about paying a debt. It's about actively trying to restore what was lost. So, in legal terms, reparation is all about addressing specific wrongful acts. This isn't some vague feeling of fairness. It's a really targeted response to a particular harm where you can clearly identify who was victimized and who was responsible for it. You can really break the whole idea down into three essential pillars. First, there has to be an acknowledgement that a wrong was actually committed. Second, the party that's responsible has to take responsibility for it. And third, a real remedy has to be provided to the victims to address what they went through. You need all three. It helps to think of reparation not as a single thing, but more like a whole toolkit. International law actually gives us 5 different tools to work with. There's restitution, that's about trying to put things back exactly as they were. Then there's compensation, the financial part. Rehabilitation is all about care, both medical and psychological. Satisfaction can be more symbolic, like a formal public apology or a memorial. And finally, and maybe this is the most important one, guarantees of non-repetition, making promises and taking action to make sure it can never, ever happen again. Okay, let's jump to our next section and see how this all plays out in the legal world. Is this just a nice moral idea, or is there a real legal duty here? So here's the crucial point. Under international law, when a state does something wrong, when it breaks its commitments, it actually creates a legal obligation to repair the damage. This isn't just a friendly suggestion. It's a fundamental principle of how countries are supposed to operate. But what about things that happened a really long time ago? This is where a legal idea called entity liability comes into play. Just think of a state like a big company. It's a continuous legal entity. The leaders change, generations come and go, but the state itself remains. And that means it can be held accountable today for things it did decades or even centuries ago. And who gets to claim this reparation? Well, the law is pretty specific about that. Of course, it recognizes the direct victims, but it also includes their immediate family who also suffered because of it. And very importantly, it recognizes that some harms are inflicted on a collective level, against whole groups of people, like indigenous communities, who can then seek reparation as a community. Of course, none of this is simple. One of the biggest hurdles, especially with these deep historical injustices, is just the sheer passage of time. Legally, you have to be able to draw a clear line connecting that original wrongful act to the harm that people are still suffering from today. The longer that line gets, the more complicated things can become. Okay, so we've talked about the what and the why. Now let's take a look at how these principles actually play out in the real world. A really big modern example comes from the Caribbean. Back in 2013, a group of 14 nations got together and formed what's called the CARICOM Reparations Commission. Their goal is to seek reparatory justice from former colonial powers for the legacies of enslavement and colonialism that are still affecting their societies today. And their plan is a perfect example of how reparation is so much more than just a check. The CARICOM plan is demanding things like a full formal apology, development programs, help with public health crises, and investment in rebuilding cultural institutions. It's all about healing the deep social wounds that are still very, very real. But reparations don't always happen on a huge international scale. There have been successful programs right inside the United States. For instance, the city of Chicago created a reparations fund for survivors of police torture, and the state of North Carolina compensated victims of a horrible forced sterilization program. These are specific remedies for very specific harms. And check out this specific court case, which really shows how those different forms of reparation get combined. In a case against the country of Suriname, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights didn't just order money for the victim's community, it also required the state to issue a public apology and to build a memorial. See? The court used multiple tools from that toolkit we talked about: compensation, satisfaction, and acknowledgement, all rolled into one. So, after all of that, what are the most important things to walk away with from this whole explainer? Let's just boil it all down. First, just remember that the core idea is about making good again. Second, it's a whole toolkit, not just money. It includes apologies, rehabilitation, and making sure it won't happen again. Third, it is a legal duty for states that do something wrong. And finally, and this is so key, it's not just about the past. It's about addressing the real, ongoing consequences of that past on people who are alive right now. When it comes right down to it, understanding this concept is just so important because it gives us a real framework for thinking about justice and accountability. It offers a structured way for societies to even begin healing these historical wounds that, let's be honest, haven't faded at all. They continue to shape the world we live in. And all of this leaves us with a final, pretty big question to think about. When the harm is so deep, so historical, and it affects so many generations, what does it really, truly take to make good again? Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this really important topic.